My research about the Lustron Houses of Macomb began about a year ago, when, as a freelance writer, I wrote an article about the Macomb Lustrons. I became intrigued and fascinated by the history of these houses and wanted to find out more. So I researched the history of the company, the story of why these houses were created, and I found out about their place in Macomb's history. Eventually, I had enough material that I presented a paper at the 11th Annual Conference on Illinois History in October of 2009 in Springfield, Illinois. And now I would like to share with you my research about these special houses. To begin to tell this story, it is logical to first ask, exactly what are Lustron houses? Lustron houses are a type of all-metal house made in the United States between 1948 and 1950. In 1949, 5 of them were erected in Macomb, Illinois. Here is a close-up of what a Lustron house looks like. Made up of interlocking 2-foot by 2-foot steel panels that have a baked-on porcelain enamel finish that are then erected onto a steel framework. Lustron houses are composed completely of metal. The roof, the exterior and interior walls, the entire ceiling, they are all made of porcelain enameled steel. Before Lustron houses were created, porcelain enameled steel panels had been used in White Castle restaurants and in gas stations during the 1930s. Another question to answer is, what exactly is porcelain enameled steel? Think of the smooth coating on a traditional washing machine, stove, or other standard appliance. That is probably porcelain enameled steel. The Lustron Company invented the word Lustron to describe their panels. This brand name was created to bring to mind the image of the luster on the steel. So, how do Lustrons fit into the post-World War II housing situation? First, what was the housing situation in the U.S. after World War II? During World War II, about 16 million served. At the end of the war, millions and millions of soldiers returned. And when they came home, they were all saying the same thing. Many had left as teenagers, still living at home with their parents, but when they returned, they were grown men, and they had been dreaming of getting married and having a place of their own. But upon returning home, they found out that there were very few new houses available to purchase or rent. What was the reason why? There were 2 main reasons why there were very few new houses for veterans to purchase or rent when they came home. One reason was that during the preceding Great Depression, house building had slowed, so there were very few new houses built from about 1929 onward. The second reason was that during the war, building materials were used for war production, so very little home building occurred during the war years. So because of the Depression and the war, there were very few new houses built between 1929 and 1945, and many existing dwellings had fallen into disrepair. Therefore, at the end of the war, the U.S. faced the greatest housing shortage ever recorded. To address the housing crisis, Congress passed the Veterans Emergency Housing Act of 1946, and as part of this act, a program was established to stimulate the production of and give priority to veterans housing. Enter the Lustron house. Could it be a possible answer to the housing crisis? The Lustron House was the brainchild of businessman and entrepreneur Carl Stronlund. He worked for Chicago Vitreous Enamel Products Company, a leading manufacturer of porcelain enameled steel. Before the war, the company had supplied porcelain enameled steel panels for gas stations and other commercial buildings. After the war, Stronlund saw a new opportunity, and he switched from gas stations to houses and came up with the idea for the Lustron House. Stronlund had a vision. Lustron's would be a new kind of house. It would be the house America has been waiting for. The Lustron would be a cheap solution to the post-war housing crunch. His idea was that Lustrons would be revolutionary because they would be mass-produced in a factory. The idea was that Lustrons would use the same mass production techniques as the automobile industry. They would be made using a standardized process to build all the parts of these low-cost houses efficiently and quickly on an assembly line. The government was very interested in getting the Lustron Company up and running because it seemed to promise to help alleviate the housing crisis. Getting the Lustron Company started would also help out the government because after the war there were idle factories. For example, warplane factories were no longer necessary. They were instantly obsolete. So the Lustron Company could put to good use a warplane factory and repurpose it. So aiding the Lustron Corporation was advantageous to the federal government. So the government made available to the Lustron Corporation a former warplane factory for production of the houses. The Lustron Company took over the former Curtiss Wright Aircraft Factory near Columbus, Ohio. It became the Lustron Corporation production plant. It became the largest porcelain enameling setup in the world, housed in one building with 8 miles of constantly moving conveyors. And the federal government also gave the Lustron Corporation generous loans to finance the startup. An innovative feature of the Lustron production process was the way that manufacture, assembly, and transportation were incorporated and considered together as a whole from beginning to end. A specially designed truck would drive into the factory and roll along the assembly line, and the completed parts of the house were placed onto the truck in the exact order of how they were to be assembled. The truck would then drive to the prepared building site, and the parts were ready to be removed in installation order. That is, the last piece that had been placed on the truck in the factory was the first piece to be removed for assembly. Here you can see all the parts of a Lustron house. The way a Lustron house was erected was straightforward. To begin work, the crew would use the included Lustron erection manual and follow the instructions. Before assembly, the first step was to lay down a concrete slab. Then the steel framework was erected. It was advertised that it would take around 3 days to put up a house. The first house came out of the factory in March 1948, but by the summer of 1950 the factory was closed. It had received orders for 20,000 houses. However, less than 3,000 orders were filled.